Welcome to Real Talk with Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua. I am your host, and this is the first segment of Real Talk. It is part of Black Power Media, and my first guest is Michelle Duster. Michelle is a writer, speaker, professor, public historian, and fighter for racial and gender equality, a Renaissance woman. In 2019, she was the recipient of the Multi-Generational Activist Award from the Illinois Human Rights Commission, and from Dartmouth College, her alma mater, she received the Martin Luther King Jr. Social Justice Award. Greetings, Michelle.
Hi, Sundiata. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Though I imagine that with the new book out, you are doing a lot of interviews, and so let me say something. You're the great granddaughter of the legendary Ida Bell Wells Barnett, and you just released a book entitled "Ida B. the Queen: The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells." And from my reading, it appears to be not only a retelling of her life and bringing in some facts that are very little known, if they've appeared in previous manuscripts, but it's also your story of your journey to, I guess one could say, inhabit the legacy of the great Ida Bell Wells Barnett. So can you tell us something about yourself beyond what appears if we Google you, something about your journey to becoming a fighter for social justice?
Right. Well, Ida B. Wells Barnett is my great-grandmother. My grandmother was Ida's youngest daughter, and I'm related to Ida through my father. And so I grew up knowing that my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was a journalist. She was a civil rights activist, a suffragist, a social worker. She was one of the co-founders of the NAACP. She was one of the co-founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the Negro Fellowship League. I mean, and in addition to all of that, she was the mother of 4 children and a wife. So she had a very full life, and I grew up knowing that I was related to her. And so obviously that shaped who I am, knowing that I was related to somebody who was a historical figure, who was somebody that, spent her entire life, her entire adult life, fighting for freedom, justice, and equality. And I knew that she was a journalist, and I knew that she used journalism as a form of activism in order to fight for change. Specifically, she was documenting the horrors, the reality of what lynching really was during her time. And so in my own journey, I was naturally drawn to the power and impact of images, media messages, and how that can shape people's attitudes. And ultimately, what I personally think happens is that it can impact policy because people are making decisions based on their own perceptions that they might actually only be getting from media images.
Now, that's I mean, her legacy is just so broad, as you just discussed. But you seem to be following a similar path. You've also been engaged in filmmaking, and you participated in the making of the film that William Greaves did, "Passion for Justice," Ida B. Wells, and so you've been involved in quite a bit yourself. Can you tell me something about the public historian activities that you're engaged in to try that keeps Ida B. Wells's contributions alive?
Right. Well, I've been engaged in quite a few different projects. One thing is our family, my father's generation, started the Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation in 1988 in order to preserve, protect, and promote her legacy. And so one of the things I've been involved in that started with my father's generation was to provide support and information to the Ida B. Wells Barnett Museum, which is located in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is Ida's hometown. It's actually the house, the physical house that her parents worked in as enslaved people. So getting close to it.
Let me cut you. I can't imagine that museum was started in the 19th century. So when did the museum?
No, not the museum. It's the house. That Ida's father was a carpenter and her mother was a cook. They worked in that house, that physical house that is located in Holly Springs. They worked there during enslavement. And here we are in 2020, and that house has been converted into a museum. And so to me, that is very fitting that when you visit that museum, you are physically on the space where Ida's parents worked as enslaved people. And my father's generation started the Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation. And so as a family, we've been involved in providing support for the museum. I also personally was involved in having a major street renamed in Chicago after Ida B. Wells. It's the first street named after any black woman or any person of color in downtown Chicago. So that was Congress Parkway was changed to Ida B. Wells Drive in 2018. I've also been involved in having a major monument created in honor of my great-grandmother. I've been working on that project for 13 years now. It will be located on the land where the Ida B. Wells Homes, which was a public housing community, once stood on the south side of Chicago. And so it will be completed this year, finally. And there are several other projects as far as historical markers. I had an honorary street name created for called Ida B. Wells Way, which is half a block away from the house that Ida actually lived in Chicago. And I'm involved in some other projects that are in the works. A couple of projects in Memphis where she lived for about 10 years. And then another project in Chicago, which will honor Chicago area suffragists. So she's one of the people that will be included in this mural. But obviously the suffrage movement was a collaborative and a collective kind of movement. So we need to recognize the other women who were also involved in that struggle.
Thank you, Michelle. And you also are working on some forthcoming books in regard to your great-grandmother. Can you tell us something about what we can expect in the near future in terms of your publications?
Well, I just want to mention I did work on I co-wrote a children's book a few years ago called Tate and His Historic Dream, which includes my great-grandmother. It's a book about a little boy who meets and interacts with 28 historical figures, and so my great-grandmother is one of them. But I'm also working on a book that will be a children's picture book, which will be published next year, that is about Ida specifically. So there are several projects that I have been involved in that are about her specifically, or about Black women specifically, or about other historical figures.
Now, a lot of people are aware that Ida B. Wells launched the anti-lynching campaign, and people are aware of her role in the creation of the Black Women's Club movement and her activities as a suffragette. But I don't think people are as aware of the kind of attention that she attracted from, one could call it, the repressive apparatuses of the U.S. state. And I note that in your book, you point out that she was visited, that the FBI actually prevented her from traveling to the Paris International Conference on Peace in 1919, and that they later, I believe in the 20s, she's late teens. She's again visited by the Secret Service in regard to the buttons. Actually, it's 1917. The buttons that she and her husband Ferdinand Barnett had produced and were distributing to try and keep the memory of the injustice of the execution of the 3rd Battalion of the 24th Regiment during the Houston pogrom. So can you talk about how and why Ida B. Wells in her early to mid 50s would become a major target for FBI and Secret Service?
Right. I mean, that's one thing that a lot of people didn't know about or don't know about, including myself. I mean, she mentioned in her autobiography that that she called them Secret Service men had come to the Negro Fellowship League, which is an organization that she and her husband founded to give housing and job assistance to get jobs in the North. And so she was working there, and she said that they came to visit her and inquired about these buttons that they heard she was distributing, which said "Murdered Negro Soldiers, December 11th, 1917." And the buttons were a way to remember and sort of memorialize these multiple soldiers, black soldiers, who had been stationed at Camp Logan, which is right outside of Houston, in 1917, in order to help build the camp and prepare to go overseas to fight for freedom and democracy. And the soldiers were met with blatant, covert, and overt racism, and they were not willing to tolerate that kind of treatment. So things escalated. It was very tense. Things escalated, and ultimately a riot broke out. And as a result of the black soldiers defending themselves, they were the ones that were charged with the crime and executed by this government, even though they were supposedly fighting for the same government. So my great-grandmother and her husband, my great-grandfather, Ferdinand Barnett, created these buttons. They originally wanted to have a memorial service, and they could not find a space to do that. But when I was looking at the FBI files, one of the things that really kind of struck me was how my great-grandmother specifically was considered and labeled as dangerous because they actually acknowledged the fact that she was a very effective speaker and writer, and they actually had excerpts of some of her writings, which showed that the power of the written word and the power of the spoken word, as far as helping people understand what their rights are and how they should fight for their rights. And so and they consider her to be very persuasive. And so that just struck me as how people who are fighting for freedom, democracy, and equality are considered to be dangerous. And we've seen that time and time again after my great-grandmother passed away in 1931. And that's why in my book I included several people who were kind of viewed in the same way after her. You know, there was Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Malcolm X and several other people that we can just name, a laundry list of names of people who were surveilled and labeled as dangerous, and there was attempts to silence them because they were speaking up in the fight for freedom, justice, and equality. So I think as a country, as a people, we need to really think about what that means, to have people considered dangerous because they are challenging the status quo, which is, a society that's based on racial and gender hierarchy.
Michelle, if your great-grandmother was alive today, what would she make of the current upsurge in militant black activity, again, fighting for for liberation. What do you think she would be doing if she was with us now?
Well, I can speak to what my great-grandmother did while she was alive, which was, I mean, we have to remember that she was born in 1862 during the Civil War, and she was born enslaved in Mississippi. And she grew up during Reconstruction. That was her formative years during Reconstruction, when there was, you know, a lot of progress when it came to rights and opportunities that formerly enslaved people had. So she was a witness to an enormous amount of progress, and she benefited from rights that were available to her that were not available to any previous generation of enslaved people. And so, you know, and then she also lived through a backlash, a very violent, extensive backlash to that progress that she, you know, was able to experience. And that, I think, is what shaped her as far as her indignation and unwillingness to kind of accept second-class citizenship as a way to live through this country. And so, you know, as far as what's happening today, I think she, you know, considering that she spent over 50 years of her adult life fighting for first-class citizenship, and to know that, you know, I'm the third generation after her, and there are 2 generations after me. So if we're talking 5 generations later, you know, some of my younger cousins, young men who are in their teenage years, are still having to deal with state-sanctioned violence. It would be, you know, I'm sure disappointing to her, but at the same time, you know, we have an African American and Asian woman as a vice president of our country. So, you know, we've made strides in some areas of our country, and we're still struggling to have, you know, absolute equality in numerous areas when it comes to the, you know, the Black American experience. So, you know, I'm sure she would have a mixed reaction to what's going on today.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. As a kind of a final question, well, not a question, but an invitation to you to talk a little bit more about yourself, and particularly the kind of the process that you went through. Because what I was intrigued by in the book is that you talk about being a typical young person, that you knew your great grandmother, the legacy, and you heard about it, but you'd rather be off with your friends. And so, how do you go from the happy-go-lucky kid to someone who now is deeply involved in social justice work?
I mean, I do live in the United States society, and I, as a Black woman, and you know, luckily I did have a very happy childhood, even though I grew up during the 1960s, which were, you know, obviously turbulent times, but somehow I just, you know, I marvel at how my parents managed to provide, you know, a sort of carefree childhood for us, considering what was going on in the country. But once I, you know, started growing and expanded, my world expanded outside of my neighborhood and outside of my circle, my small circle of friends and family, and I had to navigate my way through this country as a Black woman in a society that doesn't necessarily makes it very obvious that it doesn't have the same value for Black womanhood as it does for some other women And then it's, you know, it doesn't have the same value for women as it does for men. So, you know, I mean, I obviously became conscious of how my experience is different, how it was viewed differently, depending on who I was interacting with, how people would make assumptions about me just based on, you know, seeing me for 5 seconds, and you know, they're making judgments and treating me in a certain way. So it's kind of hard to have your own personal experiences that constantly, you know, have this sort of reminder that you are viewed in a certain way, and a lot of times they're in a negative way. And so, you know, I guess the way that I reacted to it was, I just want to do what I can to try to make an impact on the areas that I think shape some of those attitudes, which I think is really the media. Because how can people have an idea about who I am without ever without ever meeting me before them? And some of the things that they would say to me, I'm like, you got this from the news, you know, because there's no other way that they would have gotten some of the messaging that they were spewing to me as far as who they thought I was and where they thought I lived and what they thought I represented. So I just think it's a problem that needs to be solved.
Thank you, Michelle. I truly appreciate you coming on the show, and it's been somewhat experimental, but I do think it's working, and I truly appreciate you joining me today. Take
Thanks
care.
for having me.
All right. So